Good evening, and hold on to your tunics for a time-traveling romp to an era where modern conveniences were as likely as spotting a dragon, offering free Uber rides in 1200 AD. Tonight, we're yeeting ourselves through the creaky oak doors of a medieval castle where room service meant praying. Some overworked serf chucked you a candle before you're left playing hide-and-seek with the dark. I'm your guide to this chilly, funky fever dream where central heating was a fairy tale, running water was straight-up wizardry and privacy. Pfft. That was as real as a knight's Tinder profile claiming he's low maintenance. So plop down, watch out for rogue chicken feathers, and let's wade into the wild, wacky, and downright stinky life of everyone in the castle. Except the king, who's probably busy admiring his reflection in a polished shield. Picture a hulking stone fortress squatting on the landscape like a troll who skipped leg day, but aced intimidation. These walls are so beefy moving one stone would take the whole village a herd of oxen and a medieval GoFundMe for back braces. As you stumble toward the main gate, forget the fancy banners or epic stonework. The real VIP is the smell. Imagine a barnyard after a music festival mixed with wood smoke, sweaty socks, and that gym bag you meant to wash since last July. This is the castle's signature stench, and the locals are so used to it they'd probably sell it as medieval musk on Etsy. It's like living in a candle shop. You stop noticing the lavender, but everyone else is choking. The massive wooden gates strapped with enough iron to build a medieval monster truck, grown open like the castle's got a hangover and zero coffee. They're hauled by a rope and pulley system that's basically a CrossFit class run by a sadistic lord. One tug and you're sweating like you just ran a marathon in chainmail, no kale smoothies included. Step into the outer courtyard and boom, you're in the world's first chaotic co-op, designed by someone who thought personal space was a sin and more stone was the cure for everything. This place is a hot mess that'd make a modern swap meet look like a library. Kids are zooming through the crowd like they're dodging Black Friday tramplers, while chickens swagger around totally clueless. They're one grumpy cook away from being dinner. The dogs scruffy mutts with zero chill patrol as the castle's janitorial squad cleaning up messes. That'd make you rethink your life choices. The smell here is a full-on olfactory beatdown, like someone tossed a farm, a forge, and a bakery into a blender and hit puree. You've got the barnyardy funk of livestock, the metallic zap of the blacksmith's hammer, the warm hug of bread baking, and the constant whiff of folks who think bathing's a leap year event. It's a stench that'd make a health inspector fake their own death, but here, just another day in paradise. Now, let's talk architecture, because medieval castle designers clearly thought user-friendly was a curse word. Their vibe. If it keeps you alive, it's good enough, also make it miserable. The ground floor of the main keep, that surly stone tower glaring at the clouds, is basically a farmyard with a roof. Cows, horses, pigs, and chickens all crash here, turning it into a noisy, smelly petting zoo that's also your grocery store Uber and surround sound system. It's like if your garage was a 4-H fair that never ended. This setup was medieval brilliance, where brilliant meant you might not die today. Animals downstairs kept things toasty, because nothing says cozy like a horse's body heat, and doubled as a security system. Forget Ring doorbells. A flock of geese was the ultimate try-me alarm. Those honking terrors were louder than a toddler with a vuvuzela and meaner than a tax audit. Climb to the noble family's pad, the so-called penthouse, if penthouses had walls thicker than a dragon's skull and windows so tiny you'd need to be a ferret to catch a breeze. The main hall is the castle's all-in-one party zone. Dining room, living room, war room, and medieval TikTok stage crammed into one smoky stone box. It's open concept chaos where the concept was stuff everyone in here, because the rest of the castle's either Arctic sketchy or smells like pig. The hall's got long wooden tables that have seen more feasts than a Viking frat house. Benches polished by centuries of noble butts, and a fireplace so huge you could Airbnb it as a studio apartment. This fire's the castle's gossip hub. Everyone clusters around spilling tea, chugging mead, and occasionally throwing hands. The smoke, though, it's got main character energy swirling like it's auditioning for a fog machine gig. stinging eyes and adding a smoky bacon vibe to your stew. Nobody calls it mood lighting, they're too busy coughing. The walls are draped with tapestries that are the medieval multi-tool. They keep the chill out, cover up the walls' embarrassing damp spots, and scream, "We're loaded louder than a noble flexing his new sword." These woven masterpieces are like the era's version of a $10,000 accent wall, except they take a decade to make cost more than a peasant's entire village, and show off scenes of hunting battles and saints, basically Instagram but in wool and with a serious lag on posting. Climb past the main hall and we hit the so-called residential floors, where residential means you might not freeze to death, congrats. The sleeping setup here follows a pecking order tighter than a knight's armor. Unlike today's penthouse dreams, the higher you climb, the lower your status, because more stairs equaled more misery. Medieval staircases were the CrossFit of their day, and nobody was signing up for the 6 a.m. class. The Lord and Ladies' Chamber is the prime real estate close enough to eavesdrop on the great hall's gossip, high enough to feel smug, but not so high you're wheezing like you just ran a marathon in a corset. Their rooms got luxuries that'd make the castle's peasants cry into their gruel, a legit bed with a frame curtains for a rare taste of mind, your own business, a glass window fancy, and sometimes a private fireplace. It's like a medieval Four Seasons if the Four Seasons had icy stone floors, zero insulation, and a bathroom situation we'll unpack later. Spoiler, it's grim. The noble kids' rooms would give modern parents a full-blown meltdown. Cramming multiple kids into one bed wasn't just normal. It was a survival tactic. Body heat was the Bitcoin of the Middle Ages, and you hoarded it like your life depended on it, because it did. These rooms are peak minimalist, a bed, a chest for your 3 shirts, and a lucky rock, maybe a wobbly table. It's like Marie Kondo designed it, except nobody chose this vibe. It chose them. Keep climbing and you hit the servants' quarters, where personal space is as mythical as a dragon's dental plan. These rooms stuff multiple servants into spaces that make a frat house look palatial. They crash on straw mattresses that get refreshed about as often as a medieval dentist visit never-share blankets and existential dread and wake up thrilled. The ceiling didn't cave in overnight. The tippy-top floors are for storage, and during a siege, the please don't let us die zone. Sacks of grain and barrels of ale bunk with broken spears, wobbly chairs, and the shattered dreams of anyone who thought castle life was all feasts and fanfare. These attics are a sauna in summer, an icebox in winter, and always coated in dust so thick you'd think vacuum was a spell nobody learned, the wildest part of this stone skyscraper. Everyone's lives are tangled up in ways that'd make a modern HR rep faint. Work-life balance. Nope, it's just life, and it's all squashed inside these walls. The blacksmith's hammering at dawn because horses need shoes and swords need sharpening. Sorry, no snooze button. The baker's oven is roaring before the roosters even clock in because bread doesn't care about your sleep schedule. Servants are up while the stars are still partying, keeping the castle from crumbling into a pile of whoops because entropy was the original medieval influencer. Kitchen servants are up in the dark, cooking for dozens with the precision of a Michelin chef, except instead of chasing stars, they're chasing nobody got food poisoning today. Stable hands are already wrangling animals that are the castle's entire economy. Horses and oxen are the medieval equivalent of a Tesla, a FedEx truck, and a server farm, except they eat hay poop everywhere, and sometimes chomp your arm. Through it all, the castle itself hums along like a cranky old beast. Stones grumble as they settle, beams creak like they're auditioning for a haunted house, and mice scamper through the walls, totally oblivious. They're living in what future nerds will call a historical masterpiece. The windows, those rare holes of light and air, are MVPs with a side hustle. They let in daylight candles cost a fortune, and torches are basically smoke bombs. Keep the stench from hitting lethal levels when humans and animals are packed like sardines and double as sniper posts because even chill castles had to be ready for the neighbors to roll up with a battering ram and bad vibes. As evening creeps in and the windows go dark, the castle shifts into night mode in ways that'd make modern folks clutch their LED lamps. Candles and oil lamps are lit like they're rarer than unicorn tears because fuel's pricey and fire's the medieval equivalent of a toddler with matches. Families huddle up not just for warmth, but because the dark's a creepy place when your only defense is a pointy stick and optimism. The castle's soundtrack flips as night falls. Daytime's chaos, clanging tools, shouting kids fades into quiet murmurs, and the occasional lullaby that's more please sleep than twinkle star. The clatter of work dies down, replaced by the soft shuffle of folks crashing for the night. Under it all, the castle itself chills out its stones and beams breathing slow, like a giant rock dragon catching some Z's. And so, as we wrap up this peek into this bonkers world, think about this while we whine about spotty Wi-Fi or a 3-minute coffee wait, castle folks, measured success by the basics. Did we eat? Is the roof still on? Are the kids all in their human puppy pile beds? Will the fire last till morning? Their lives were a grind we can't even fathom, packed with struggles that'd make us cry into our lattes. But they kept it simple shelter safety survival. As you doze off tonight in your toasty room with clean water a step away and light at a switch's flick, maybe tip your hat to how far we've come and how these medieval maniacs pulled off so much with a whole lot of nothing. Now that we've survived the living quarters, let's stumble into the castle's beating heart, the kitchen. And when I say heart, I mean it's like the reactor core of a spaceship, crucial, hotter than a dragon's hiccup, and one wrong move could turn the whole place into a crispy medieval disaster. The kitchen's stashed as far from the fancy living areas as the castle's stone maze allows, which screams, we know, fire's a jerk. It's like keeping your BBQ grill in a shed across town, except the shed's linked to your house by drafty stone hallways that could double as wind turbines. Why simple kitchens caught fire so often, they figured if it went up in flames, maybe the rest of the castle could hold on long enough to send a desperate prayer skyward. No insurance, no problem. Just beg the saints for a miracle. Stepping into this kitchen is like warping into a dimension where food safety rules are just a cruel joke. The star of this sweaty chaos is a fireplace so massive you could barbecue a whole cow in it. And trust me, they did with a side of, why not? This beast makes a modern chef's stove look like a toy oven from a kid's playset. It's the medieval equivalent of a turbocharged grill, if the grill was run by sweaty serfs and fueled by enough logs to wipe out a forest. The fire roars 24/7, tended by kitchen grunts, whose job is basically keep it lit. Don't burn the castle down, and try not to turn into a human torch. It's like being a lifeguard, but instead of watching for sharks, you're dodging sparks that could make the whole place a very toasty oopsie. Hovering over this inferno is a wild tangle of chains, hooks, and pulleys that'd give a modern engineer a panic attack. Giant iron pots big enough to feed a Viking raiding party, which, let's be real, they basically were dangle like medieval chandeliers. These cauldrons are so heavy when full, it takes 3 beefy dudes to budge them. Cooking here was less dinner prep and more team-building exercise for gladiators. The head cook, a grizzled survivor who somehow kept all their fingers despite decades of dodging flames and knives, runs this madness like a warlord directing a siege. And honestly, that's not far off. The kitchen crew moves with the precision of a SWAT team because feeding a castle is a logistical nightmare that'd make a wedding planner quit and join a monastery. Menu planning here would make a dietitian faint. Breakfast. Picture chugging ale and gnawing on bread. Not because medieval folks were living their best brunch life, but because ale was safer than the local water, aka swamp juice, and bread was cheap enough to keep you from starving before noon. It's like pounding a beer and a bagel every morning, except it's not a hangover cure, it's how you stay alive. The bread itself is a legend, and not the tasty kind. Calling it bread is like calling a rock furniture technically true, but good luck with it. These loaves were so dense, you could use them to fend off bandits. The crust was tough enough to double as a shield, and the inside was like chewing a very angry sourdough that fought back. Fresh bread was for the Lord's VIP table. Everyone else got yesterday's loaf, now hard enough to build a house with. Making this bread was an Olympic-level ordeal that kicked off before the roosters even thought about crowing. Bakers waded through flour clouds so thick they looked like they were starring in a low-budget snowstorm. Kneading the dough was a workout that'd make a bodybuilder cry, and shoving it into giant stone ovens was like playing Russian roulette with heat hope. You guessed the temperature. Right lunch was the main event, the kitchen's time to flex. Imagine the wildest dinner party you've ever seen, then crank it up to feed a small army and strip away every modern gadget. Prep started right after breakfast and roped in more people than a reality show cast. Servants buzzed around like caffeinated ants, each with jobs so specific they'd been perfected through centuries of, well, that didn't work. Moments mostly. The whoops we poisoned the Duke kind. The meat course was the rock star, and by rock star I mean it either slayed or sent everyone running for cover. Whole animals were roasted on spits, turned by kitchen boys who were basically human hamster wheels. These kids, barely old enough to tie their own shoes, stood by the fire for hours cranking the spit with metronome-level rhythm. It was like being a DJ spinning tracks, except your mix was a pig and the club was a 1,000-degree death trap. The menu was a zoo on a stick. Sure, you had beef and pork, but also deer, wild boar, rabbits, and birds from chickens to, yep, swans. Swans. Medieval nobles thought chowing down on these pawn princesses was peak class, like serving bald eagle at a gala. It's the kind of flex that'd get you canceled on Modern X, but back then, total baller move. Seasoning was half art, half wishful thinking. Salt was so pricey it was basically medieval Bitcoin people got paid in it, hence worth his salt. Pepper was a status symbol gifted to kings, like it was a gold-plated chariot. Other spices like cinnamon came via trade routes so sketchy, delivering a pinch was worth a bard's ballad. Sprinkle that on your stew, and you're basically royalty. The kitchen's herb garden was the castle's Swiss Army knife. It spiced up food. Cured your weird rash. Good luck and masked the taste of meat that was, let's say, past its prime. Refrigeration, huh? That was hoping winter lasted, eating fast, or just vibing with kind of funky as a flavor note. Food preservation was a wild gamble that'd make a health inspector quit on the spot. Meat was salted, smoked, or pickled in vats so intense they could have preserved a knight's armor. Veggies swam in vinegar strong enough to strip paint. Fish was dried until it was basically Jerky's grumpy grandpa. It's like meal prep for the apocalypse with enough salt to melt an iceberg. The storage areas were a shrine to medieval optimism about pest control. Grain sat in huge barrels that rats treated like a Vegas buffet. The kitchen crew's war on rodents was like a cartoon showdown, think Tom and Jerry. But Jerry's eating your winter rations, and your whack is a ladle you threw in desperation. Water for cooking came from wells that'd make a modern health inspector sprint to the nearest decontamination shower. This stuff was so murky you'd swear it was hiding a school of minnows, with a taste like it was filtered through a knight's old boot. Boiling it was non-negotiable, not for flavor, but because you didn't want to croak from a sip. The medieval water purifier, cook it till it stops twitching, was the vibe. The kitchen crew was a squad of ironclad survivors shrugging off germs that'd send us modern softies to the ER. They toiled in heat that'd violate every OSHA rule ever written, swinging knives sharp enough to perform surgery, but handled with the chill of folks who'd been slicing since they could toddle. Oh, and their outfits 100% flammable, dancing around open flames like it was a Tuesday. Picture a modern chef's kitchen, but swap out safety gear for extra ways to accidentally combust. Dinner service was a high-stakes ballet that'd make a Broadway show look like a school play. Servants formed a human assembly line, schlepping dishes through corridors clearly designed by someone who hated efficiency. The trek from kitchen to dining hall was so long food arrived at A lukewarm, which was fine. Castle room temp was basically your fridge's crisper drawer anyway. The serving dishes were straight-up flexes, doubling as art status symbols and emergency blunt objects. Pewter plates screamed we're rich for the elite. Everyone else got wooden bowls that said you're lucky to eat. Individual place settings as rare as a medieval streaming service. Sharing was the law bowls cups, and the faint hope that your tablemate didn't have the plague. Dinner chit-chat was wilder than a reality TV reunion. Forget venting about your boss or weekend plans, medieval diners debated which neighbor might yeet an army at them. Come spring, if the crops would keep starvation at bay, and whether eating pork on a Friday would land them in eternal timeout. It's like a dinner party where the small talk is life or death, and nobody's got a backup plan. Cleanup was a sanitation nightmare that'd make modern germaphobes weep. Dishes got washed in water that had done triple duty all day, dried with rags older than some castles, and stashed in cupboards that were basically mouse Airbnb listings. Leftovers were divvied up via a food chain stricter than a royal court. Nothing went to waste because wasting food was a flex only dragons could afford. Kitchen mishaps were so common, seasoned cooks wore scars like Michelin stars, burns from the inferno-level fires, slices from knives sharpened to a razor's edge, and the occasional bonk from a low-hanging cauldron were just part of the gig. Workers' comp if you lived long enough to dodge a pot to the head, you were basically a kitchen ninja. The night's final boss was banking the fires, a high wire act to keep the kitchen from either torching the castle or going stone cold. Relighting a fire with medieval tech was a slog that'd make fiddling with a finicky BBQ seem like a breeze. A dead fire meant cold porridge and a lord grumpier than a dragon with a toothache. And so the kitchen wound down its banked fires, glowing like napping lizards, the day's cooking smells baked into the stones like a culinary ghost story. The kitchen crew beat from another day of dodging death by stew crashed in their bunks with the smug glow of folks who'd fed a castle without poisoning anyone or turning the place into a giant campfire. Tomorrow would sling the same chaos, turning raw ingredients into meals with tools that were caveman level by today's standards, but cutting edge for the 1200s, keeping a castle's worth of bellies full, and doing it all with the kind of dark humor you get when your job is both insanely tough and the only thing keeping everyone from starving. Having survived the kitchen's fiery chaos, let's sashay into the world of medieval interior design. Think HGTV, but with 90% less furniture and a whole lot more vibes. If Marie Kondo time-traveled to the 13th century, she'd be over the moon, not because castle life sparked joy, but because there was barely enough stuff to cause clutter. Medieval minimalism wasn't a Pinterest trend. It was just life when most things hadn't been invented, and your budget screamed survival only. The castle's decorating mantra was peak practicality. If you can't munch it, wear it, or whack an invader with it, it's probably dead weight. This wasn't some chic aesthetic. It was the reality of a world where every item was handcrafted or bartered for at the cost of your best cow. Picture IKEA's sleek simplicity, but swap the Swedes for sweaty serfs, and fast forward the modern part by 7 centuries. Strolling through a castle's living spaces feels like touring a furniture store after a picky tornado snatched everything non-essential, leaving only gear that could moonlight as a siege weapon. The furniture that did exist was built like it was auditioning for Immortal Table of the Year. Forget IKEA's wobbly nonsense. These oak beasts were crafted to survive generations' floods, and that one time Uncle Cedric tried indoor jousting after too much mead. The main hall, our old pal from earlier, is the poster child for medieval multitasking. By day, it's a dining room packing 40 folks onto benches so polished by centuries of butts, they're smoother than a royal's ego. These benches, carved from single oak slabs, were so heavy moving one was like organizing a medieval flash mob. The tables, massive wooden fortresses with legs thick enough to prop up a castle tower. They're like your cousin's rustic farmhouse table, except these actually came from farms and could probably stop a runaway ox. Come evening, this hall morphs into the medieval equivalent of a pop-up party venue. Shoving the tables aside took the teamwork of an Apollo mission and enough grunting to risk a hernia. Once cleared, the space hosted dancing, storytelling, and games born from pure imagination, because when your Netflix is just make it up, you get creative. It's like a living room that converts to a nightclub if the conversion involved a gym session and a prayer for no injuries. Seating in the Great Hall followed a pecking order tighter than a knight's corset. The lord and lady parked their noble behinds in actual chairs with backs and everything at the head table, looking like the medieval equivalent of dinner dictators. These chairs were rarer than a dragon's good mood, making them a bigger flex than a modern supercar. Everyone else benches stools, or for the lowliest servants just standing there, munching, which was less rude and more welcome to the food chain. The walls sported tapestries that were the Swiss Army knife of medieval decor. First, they kept the chill at bay in a world where insulation meant add another blanket and cry. These woven wonders were like wallpaper, but instead of peel and stick, they were hand-stitched by artisans over years, cost more than a peasant's house, and showed off epic hunts, bloody battles, or saintly shenanigans, not a floral print in sight. Tapestries were also the ultimate humble brag, like hanging a Monet in your condo, except Monet's still centuries away. And the vibe is, check out my violent hobbies. A castle dripping in tapestries screamed, we're loaded. Bare walls. That's the medieval equivalent of a studio apartment with a folding chair and a dream. Hanging these bad boys was a DIY nightmare that'd make Joanna Gaines quit. Castle walls didn't come with command strips, so you had to hammer iron rings into the mortar like you were mounting a siege engine. The tapestries were so heavy redecorating was a village-wide cardio event with more logistics than a modern kitchen reno. Daytime lighting came from windows planned with the paranoia of a bunker designer because, well, they kind of were. These narrow slits were less about sunshine and more about letting archers yeet arrows at invaders while staying arrow-proof themselves. They're like smart home security that just happens to let in a sliver of light. Glass windows, when they existed, were a flex so big they cost as much as a cottage. Most windows were just holes with wooden shutters to block rain raiders or that nosy neighbor with a catapult. Owning glass was like rolling up in a spaceship, pure look at me energy, with a side of I'm the future. At night, lighting was a high-stakes game of don't burn the castle down. Candles, oil lamps, and torches were rationed like gold in a dungeon crawl. Candles were stupid expensive lighting. One was like setting a stack of cash on fire. Beeswax burned clean, but cost a fortune. Tallow was cheaper, but smoked like a bad BBQ and smelled like someone deep-fried a gym sock. Oil lamps were the reliable middle child, but they needed animal fat or imported olive oil, which wasn't exactly growing in medieval Yorkshire. These were like floor lamps that gave off less light than a glow stick and might explode if you sneezed wrong. Torches. The heavy metal option, great for big spaces, but basically a flaming stick begging to turn your hall into a bonfire. Wall-mounted torch holders were placed with OCD-level care to avoid torching the tapestries, because, whoops, there goes, the castle wasn't a great look. The sleeping quarters in the castle were a masterclass in medieval furniture design, think, function over fluff, with a side of hope you like straw. Beds ranged from jaw-dropping setups that'd make a modern carpenter jealous to setups so basic your camping air mattress looks like a 5-star resort. The Lord and Lady's bed was a hulking 4-poster beast, doing way more than just cradling their noble snoozes. Those posts held up heavy curtains that screamed privacy, please, in a world where alone time was rarer than a unicorn with Wi-Fi. Plus, the raised platform kept them above the icy stone floor and the creepy crawlies that treated it like a freeway. These beds were like medieval VIP suites with curtains you could yank shut for warmth secrecy, or to pretend you weren't bunking 3 feet from a dozen cousins and a stray goat. The mattress. A giant sack stuffed with straw, feathers, or whatever else could pass as not a rock. Comfort wasn't exactly cloud-like, it was more, you probably won't die sleeping on this, so quit whining. Bed linens made of linen, or wool, were washed about as often as a knight swapped his armor, meaning good luck. These sheets were the medieval equivalent of high thread count, except the goal was less silky smooth and more holds up through a year of sweat and despair. Fresh sheets were for VIPs' big parties, or when the old ones were so crusty they could star in a horror flick. For the castle's B-list, aka everyone else sleeping, was a team sport. Servants piled into shared beds not because they loved cuddling, but because it was that or freeze. These setups would make a modern fire marshal faint, but they delivered body heat and a buddy system against the rats and bugs eyeing your bed as prime real estate. It It's like a sleepover, except it's every night, and the snacks are hope. Kids' rooms leaned hard into the radical idea that tiny humans need less space, plus the cold fact that they'd be sharing everything, beds, blankets, and the job of not turning into icicles by dawn. Furniture was bare bones, a bed, a chest for the family's 3 shirts, and a lucky pebble, maybe a stool that moonlighted as a table chair or step to reach the top bunk. It's like a minimalist Airbnb with a survive the night vibe. Storage was a declutterer's dream, handled by wooden chests that'd make a modern organizer swoon. Your whole life had to fit in 1 or 2 boxes, forcing a keep-it-lean mindset that'd impress a TED Talk guru. These chests were medieval U-Hauls, portable hand-carved, and built to hold your entire net worth, not just your old yoga mats and holiday decor. Clothing storage was so simple it was almost poetic, with only 2 or 3 outfits, one for daily grind, one for church flexing, and a spare for when the others were getting patched. You didn't need a walk-in closet. Clothes were folded into chests with surgical precision because wrinkles were forever, and your fancy tunic had to last through decades of feasts. Personal items were treated like museum relics because they kind of were. A metal mirror, worth more than your annual rent. A hairbrush, a family heirloom you'd will to your kids. Even needles and thread were so precious they'd show up in legal documents like they were the crown jewels. It's like your junk drawer, but every item's a priceless artifact. Decor for decor's sake was as alien as a media room. Everything had to pull its weight, but that didn't stop folks from jazzing up their gear. A wooden bowl might sport fancy carvings, but it was still for stew. A chest could rock iron bling and painted swirls, but its real job was keeping your socks safe from damp thieves and the castle's resident rat gang. Beauty was a bonus, not the point. The floors were stone blanketed with rushes that were the medieval answer to carpet air freshener and trash can in one eco-nightmare package. These were swapped out about as often as you upgrade your phone, meaning the bottom layers turned into a compost heap that'd thrill a hipster gardener but make a health inspector quit on the spot. Fresh rushes got tossed on top, creating a squishy, fragrant floor that felt like walking on a moldy sponge. This setup trapped spilled ale, soaked up mystery liquids, and hosted a bug and mouse condo complex so thriving they probably had a homeowners association. It's like living on a landfill you call cozy. Bare walls, when not draped in tapestries, were plastered and slathered in paints that'd make a modern designer either geek out over authenticity or cry at the sheer practicality. Made from whatever local dirt or plants could hold a hue, these colors were built to survive the chaos of a stone castle filled with folks who treated gentle like a foreign language. Privacy was a DIY project, curtain screens, and a group vibe of, let's pretend we don't see that. Actual private rooms were for the lordly elite, and even then private was a loose term. It's like having roommates, except it's your whole family, the staff, and some random duke crashing for 6 months to talk trade while eating your stew. The castle's design was a glorious mashup of necessity and grit, where every item earned its spot by being useful tough or just too hard to replace. It was minimalism by force, not choice crafting spaces that were sparse, yet loaded with character, basic, yet weirdly elegant. Modern decorators chased this vibe with mood boards. Medieval folks just lived it because stuff was a luxury, and survival was the ultimate aesthetic. Having gawked at the castle's bare-bones chic, let's dive into its so-called climate control system. Calling it that is like dubbing a soggy twig a bonfire starter. Medieval heating wasn't about cozy vibes. It was about dodging an indoor frostbite death scene, which back then counted as living the dream. The castle's main heat machine was the great fireplace in the main hall, a stone behemoth so huge it could double as a dragon's barbecue pit. This thing was so massive you could park a few grown adults inside it handy when some poor soul had to shimmy up the chimney with a brush and a prayer to not become a medieval chimney sweep pancake. Building these fireplaces was a wild mix of genius and hope. This doesn't collapse. Master Masons juggled draft science fire physics, and please don't crush us engineering that wouldn't get a textbook for centuries, the chimney. A stone labyrinth that looked like it was designed by a drunk architect, who hated straight lines and gravity's feelings. Running this inferno was like managing a mini lumber mill with a side of pyromania. The fire guzzled logs the size of coffee tables, tended by servants who were basically spark tamers with a splash of "don't let us all die." These folks had fire whispering skills that'd make a modern survivalist jealous, and lungs that laughed at smoke like it was just spicy air. The fireplace's wood appetite would make a modern eco-warrior faint. One day's blaze could eat enough timber to build a treehouse, and it roared non-stop from fall to spring. Keeping the castle toasty meant running a full-on logging empire with hand axes and ox carts that crawled slower than a sloth in traffic. Heat spread via the medieval rule of sit close or freeze. Seating in the hall wasn't about who's the fanciest, it was about who'd nab the warm spot before their toes went numb. The lord and lady got the prime fire-adjacent real estate not for clout, but because even nobles weren't immune to turning blue. It was like a game of musical chairs, but the soundtrack was crackling logs, and the prize was not becoming an ice sculpture. The fire's warmth reached about as far as a T-Rex's arms. Snag a spot by the blaze, and your front side might feel like a sunny beach while your back was auditioning for Arctic expedition. Step a few feet away, and you're in a frosty zone, so chilly penguins would pack a scarf. Upstairs heating was a combo of wishful thinking, extra prayers, and just wear everything you own. Fancier rooms might have mini fireplaces, but these were more cute glow than actual heat warming a space the size of a broom closet if you stood in it hugging the coals. Perfect for folks planning to hibernate in 1 square foot all winter. Sleeping arrangements leaned hard into the power of snuggle physics. Families piled into beds not for warm fuzzies, but because the alternative was waking up as a human icicle. Kids were sprinkled among adults like tiny space heaters, and everyone slept in their day clothes because pajamas were for people who didn't expect to see their breath indoors. Warming the bed was a nightly saga that'd make your bedtime routine look like a TikTok trend. Servants slid warming pans, iron trays stuffed with hot coals between the sheets to nudge the bed from polar vortex to slightly less miserable. These were medieval heated blankets, except they could torch your linens or give you a toasty new scar if you got cocky. Those heavy bed curtains we mentioned, they weren't just for VIP vibes, they trapped body heat like a woolly force field, turning your bed into a semi-cozy cocoon. It was like camping in a fabric fort, except the stakes were don't freeze instead of s'mores or bust. Blankets were woolen tanks so heavy you'd need a gym membership to lift them, and so scratchy they felt like cuddling a sheep that hadn't showered. Layering them was a strategic art form, like planning a siege, because one wrong move meant waking up with frost on your nose. Bedtime fashion. Just keep your day clothes on. Maybe toss on an extra cloak if the wind was howling. Wool tunics, thick socks, and sometimes a full-on cape made you look like you were prepping for a winter hike, not a nap. It worked since your wardrobe was basically 3 outfits or bust anyway. Personal heaters were sketchy at best. Hand warmers, metal boxes with hot coals could thaw your fingers if you didn't mind the risk of singeing your mittens or blowing up like a tiny grenade. They were like pocket warmers, but with a vibe of handle with care or regret. Foot warmers were ceramic, or metal jars packed with hot water, or stones tucked at the bed's foot or under a desk. Think mini space heaters that only cared about your toes, needed constant refills, and stayed warm about as long as your coffee before it's iced latte time. The kitchen, as we know, was the castle's hotspot, thanks to its eternal cooking fires. Kitchen staff crashed nearby, not because they were workaholics, but because it was the one place you could wake up without icicles on your eyelashes. It was like getting a job with a heated cubicle, except the heat came from roasting oxen, not a thermostat. Workshops and storage areas were toasty, only if you count sweating from sheer terror as heating. The blacksmith's forge was a fiery sauna for anyone gutsy enough to dodge molten metal, and rogue sparks think workout by lava lamp vibes. The brewery. A yeasty sweat lodge warmed by fermenting ale smelling like a frat party and buzzing with flies that RSVP'd without asking. These spots were hot from hard labor, not cozy intentions, so unless your job was hammer stuff or brew stuff, you'd rather shiver elsewhere. The castle's stone walls were champs at stopping enemy arrows, but absolute traitors when it came to keeping out the cold. Stone sucks up warmth like a vampire at a blood bank, so brushing against a wall in winter was like high-fiving a Yeti's fridge. These walls yeeted indoor heat straight outside with the efficiency of a reverse space heater, making chilly the castle's default setting. Window coverings were the unsung heroes of not freezing to death. Heavy shutters slammed shut against winter's wrath, blocking wind snow and the heat-sucking void of the outdoors. They were medieval storm windows, but when closed, they turned your room into a pitch-black cave. Opening them each morning meant a brave soul had to face a blast of Arctic air just to let in some sunlight, heroic. But also, why is my face numb? The stone floors glued to the frosty earth below stayed colder than a polar bear's picnic. Strolling across them in winter was like tap dancing on an ice rink, designed to steal your toe warmth. Rushes tossed on top helped a bit, but going barefoot was a frostbite dare that made modern ice bucket challenges look like a spa day. Clothing was all about piling on layers, like you're prepping for a moon mission. Medieval folks rocked wool next to skin linen over that more wool for good measure and leather, as the cherry on top, basically a fabric burrito with you as the filling. Getting dressed was like suiting up for a textile joust, trapping every scrap of body heat before it could escape to the castle's icy embrace. Rich folks flaunted fur-lined gear that'd make a modern parka jealous, while everyone else stacked whatever rags they could scrounge. Hats were non-negotiable indoors, not for style, but because your head was a heat-leaking traitor. Medieval fashion was pure survival cosplay, where look good took a back seat to don't turn blue. Bathing in winter. Nope, that was on hold until spring, and not because people loved their own funk. Getting wet when the castle felt like a meat locker was a one-way ticket to Shiversville population U. Hygiene mattered, but not as much as avoiding a hypothermic dirt nap. Cleanliness could wait. Coffins couldn't. Medieval heating boiled down to layer up and hug the fire, a strategy that kept you breathing, but wouldn't win any comfy home awards. It was less about tech and more about grit, forcing folks to toughen up or bundle up, rather than tweaking a thermostat. Compared to our climate-controlled cribs, it was like living in a fridge with a campfire and a dream. Now that we've thawed out from the castle's frosty climate control, let's tiptoe into the wild world of personal hygiene medieval style. Spoiler hygiene back then was like a unicorn at a joust. Everyone swore it existed, a few bragged about spotting it, but actual proof rarer than a knight who showers. Medieval clean was a whole different beast from our squeaky clean standards, where we see daily showers as non-negotiable. They eyed regular bathing like we'd eye juggling flaming torches on a tightrope doable. But why risk it? Their health logic was ironclad. Too much water might kill you, and they weren't wrong. When clean water was basically swamp soup, bathing was less a habit and more a blockbuster event planned with the fanfare of a royal coronation. You'd scrub down for big deal moments Easter, a fancy feast, or when your grime layer started jamming doorways. And it wasn't daily. It was once a season if you're feeling wild. Setting up a bath was a logistical circus that'd make a modern-day spa look like a kiddie pool party. First, you needed buckets of water dragged from wells or creeks heated in cauldrons over fires that could have roasted a boar, then lugged to the bathing spot. This water-hauling relay ate up so much time and firewood, it was like choosing between a bath or not starving. Tough call. The bathtub. A giant wooden barrel that pulled double duty all year. When it wasn't your once-a-year splash zone, it might store grain water horses or even seat extra cousins at a crowded feast. It was the medieval Swiss Army knife of furniture, except one setting involved nudity and a side of hope. This is sanitary. Water sharing was a germaphobe's nightmare. The Lord got first dibs on the steamy clean stuff, then his wife, then the kids' VIPs first, and finally the lucky servants who scored bath privileges. By the time the last guy hopped in the water was a murky stew that'd make a sewer worker gag. Think communal hot tub, but with zero chlorine and a vibe of what's floating in here. Soap was the medieval equivalent of a Birkin bag, pricey, rare, and a total flex. Made from animal fat and ash, it smelled like a BBQ gone wrong and scrubbed your skin like sandpaper with an attitude. It worked, but you'd emerge smelling like a campfire and feeling like you'd lost a layer of epidermis. No soap, no problem. People got creative with dirt-busting hacks. Sand was the go-to for scrubbing great, for caked-on muck, but also for peeling off your top skin, layer exfoliation medieval style. Oatmeal paste doubled as a cleanser and an emergency snack if your bath dragged on. Herbs got rubbed on in a hopeful, maybe this'll make me smell less like a barn gamble. Hair washing was a saga that'd make a modern salon stylist quit. You'd whip up a potion of herbs, eggs, and whatever else sounded cleansing, then spend hours slathering it on. The goal hair that felt less like hay and smelled less like the stable. It was less shampoo commercial and more, I hope this works before I lose my mind. Hair got washed maybe 2 or 3 times a year, plenty, since it was usually hidden under hats, hoods, or veils. Medieval hair care was 100% organic, sourced from whatever grew nearby, and about as effective as wishing for a blowout. Think DIY spa day with a side of good enough. Dental hygiene. If your chompers could handle the rock-hard bread. They were fine until they screamed for mercy. Toothbrushes were just twigs you chewed into a frayed mess. Think nature's dental tool with all the precision of flossing with a stick. It was like modern dentistry if your dentist was a gardener with a dream. Teeth were expected to last as long as you did, which given medieval lifespans wasn't saying much. Tooth trouble. You'd swig ale pray hard or let the castle's resident surgeon, aka the guy with steady hands and no fear of blood, yank it out. Dental care was less smile bright and more survive the pain. Breath freshening was a game of chew and hope. Mint was the holy grail when you could get it, but most folks munched local herbs and crossed their fingers. Bad breath was a thing, but starving was worse, so you ate what you had and hoped your chat buddy didn't faint. It was less minty fresh and more at least I'm alive. Clothing cleanliness was a laundry nightmare that'd make a modern dry cleaner cry. With only a couple of outfits to your name, washing was a rare ordeal that left you half naked while your tunic drip dried. Clothes got scrubbed in bulk once or twice a year, using buckets of water, a prayer for soap, and enough elbow grease to power a windmill. It was less fresh laundry scent, and more thank God it's not moving anymore. Laundry day was a medieval marathon that'd make a modern laundromat look like a spa. Clothes got dunked in giant tubs scrubbed with brushes or rocks, until they begged for mercy, then hung to dry for what felt like a geological era, depending on whether the sun felt like showing up. While your duds were air drying, you'd rock whatever backup gear you had. Usually a tunic too tight, too baggy, or yoinked from your cousin's chest, making you look like you lost a bet at a costume party. Undergarments, when they weren't just a fever dream, were linen layers, playing goalie between your skin and the outer clothes, which got washed about as often as a castle got a new king. These undies saw more sink time than the overcoats, but their cleaning schedule would make a modern underwear ad campaign about daily freshness choke on its own tagline. Deodorant, still a few centuries from being a twinkle in a chemist's eye. Body odor was tackled with herbs stuffed in pockets, perfumes brewed from flower petals and oils, and a group pact that everyone reeked like a barnyard, so no shade throwing allowed. It was less fresh scent, and more were all in this funk together. Perfumes and scented oils were the medieval equivalent of a private jet only for the loaded and used like your rationing gold, whipped up from local blooms, herbs, or pricey imported oils. These fragrances were as regional as a craft beer and better at luring bees than charming dates. A dab was a flex, not a daily spritz. Rich folks could swap undies more often and splurge on fancy soaps and scents, but they were still playing the same hygiene game as the peasants, just with shinier toys. It was like the difference between glamping and regular camping. You're still in a tent, but one's got a velvet sleeping bag. Clean was a dream nobody fully caught. Grooming tools were straight out of the local carpenter's shed or a trader's risky road trip. Combs, carved from bone or wood, were built to survive decades of detangling like medieval tanks. mirrors polished metal that gave you a reflection fuzzier than a bad Zoom call. So grooming was more feel it out than check your angles. Men's razors were basically sharpened daggers demanding ninja-level skills to avoid turning your face into a medieval art project. Shaving was either a pro job or a hold my ale moment, done as often as you had a sharp blade and enough guts to wield it. Beard trends. More about tool access than hipster or clean cut. Women's grooming was all about hair wrangling and skin survival. Hair got braided, pinned, and stuffed under headgear that screamed practical and don't mess with me. Skincare meant slathering on oils or herbal goops to fend off sun and wind, less glow up and more don't crack like old leather. Medieval hygiene was all grit, no glam, aimed at dodging the plague rather than chasing a spa day vibe. It was about staying just healthy enough to keep swinging in a world where alive was the ultimate flex. Clean wasn't a lifestyle, it was a side quest you tackled when you had the energy. Bathing followed a seasonal rhythm, peaking in spring when you could dunk without freezing solid, then sliding downhill through summer and fall. By late winter, layered in heavy wool and unwashed for months, you'd hit peak funk, a stench fest so normal it was just Tuesday to medieval noses. Hygiene's social rules hinged on everyone being in the same smelly boat. Calling out someone's BO was as rude as stealing their stew, unless they were so ripe they could clear a room, then you'd drop a polite, maybe visit the river hint. Everyone knew their own aroma wasn't exactly rose petals, so judgment was kept on a leash. From the fragrant chaos of medieval hygiene, we strut into the world of clothing, where fast fashion meant a new tunic in 6 months instead of 6 years. And seasonal collections were just stuff to not freeze in winter versus stuff to not roast in summer. Forget chasing Paris trends, medieval style was about survival, not shade throwing at court. Medieval fashion would make a modern eco-warrior sob with joy, and a fast fashion fan question their life. Your average Joe owned 2 to 4 outfits total, a wardrobe so curated it'd make a minimalist influencer jealous, and so green it'd shame a Prius. This wasn't a flex, it was just how you rolled when clothes took forever to make. The MVP of medieval threads was linen spun from flax in a process so grueling it made binge-watching a series look like a coffee break. Growing flax, harvesting it, soaking it till it rotted just right, spinning it into thread and weaving it into fabric took a year and a village of pros. It was like crafting a single t-shirt with the dedication of a PhD dissertation. Linen was the great equalizer worn by everyone from serfs to lords as the base layer uniting all in the joy of scratching like you're wearing a potato sack. This stuff felt like sandpaper's angrier cousin and had the comfort of a hay bale hug, but its soaked up sweat could be washed sometimes and was the only game in town. Over the linen you'd pile on wool that ranged from Brillo pad chic for peasants to slightly less stabby Brillo pad for nobles. Wool ruled because sheep were everywhere. It stayed warm even when soaked, and you didn't need to haggle with far-off silk merchants. It was the medieval equivalent of a trusty hoodie, local practical and built for the grind. Turning sheep fluff into a tunic was a village-wide saga that'd make a modern sweatshop look like a craft fair. You'd wrestle ornery sheep for their wool clean the gunk out card, it like you're untangling a dragon's mane, spin it into yarn and weave it into fabric. Every step needed skills passed down like your grandma's secret stew recipe, and the tools were as high-tech as a stick and a prayer. Wool quality was a science medieval folks nailed without a lab coat. The primo stuff came from pampered sheep living their best lives on choice pastures. The rough stuff was from scrappy sheep who'd been through medieval boot camp, their fleece tough enough to double as armor. Wearing the coarse kind, congrats, you're basically in a hair shirt cosplay. Dyeing your duds was a flex that screamed, I'm somebody, from across the moat. Fancy dyes came from stuff straight out of a wizard's pantry, crushed bugs, rare snails, or plants hauled from who knows where. Purple from murex shells was so pricey rocking it was like strutting in a gold-plated cape. It cost more than actual bling, and you'd milk that status for all it was worth. Red dye made from squashed cochineal bugs was vibrant enough to make your tunic a medieval Ferrari. Blue from woad or indigo needed a dye master's magic touch to avoid looking like you dipped your shirt in a muddy puddle. Most folks stuck to local dyes, berries, roots, whatever, churning out earthy tones that faded fast. Modern designers would call it rustic chic. Medieval folks called it what we've got. Clothes were built like tanks sewn with stitches so tough they'd laugh at modern yoga pants. These garments were made to survive decades of hauling hay scrubbing floors and being handed down like a family sword. Seams were reinforced like they were prepping for a Viking raid because your tunic had to outlast medieval life's daily beatdowns. The go-to outfit for everyone was the tunic, a baggy knee-to-ankle shirt that screamed one size fits most. Tunics were the medieval tracksuit, comfy enough adjustable with belts or pins and perfect for anyone from a twig to a tank. Length varied by status fabric stash and whether you'd rather not trip or not freeze. Men rocked tunics over linen undies paired with leg wraps or hose, basically wool leggings that were the tights of their day. These were tied to belts or undies with a rigging system so fiddly it was like maintaining a sailboat. One wrong knot and your hose were sagging like a sad bard's ballad. Women's gear followed the same vibe, but with extra layers to keep things proper. You'd start with a linen chemise toss on a wool kirtle or gown, and maybe add a fancy overlayer to flex your status. More layers, richer colors, and fancier stitching. Said, I'm a big deal without needing a crown. Underwear as we know it. Nope. The linen chemise was your only buffer, so you were basically freeballing under your wool. It saved on laundry since you barely had any, and kept costs low, but it meant your tunic was your skin's BFF for months. Clothes were cut to handle the, intimacy without turning into a biohazard. Shoes were either basic leather slippers that barely kept the dirt off, or beefy boots built to survive medieval roads, rain, and whatever gunk was on the castle floor. Local cobblers made footwear to last years, trudging through mud and rushes like a champ. No left or right shoes were equal opportunity torture for both feet, and that was a feature, not a bug. Fancy folks had sleek leather kicks with pro stitching. Peasants got leather sacks with strings, less shoe, and more footbag. Either way, they were built for function, not fashion, because nobody had time to limp when there was a harvest to haul. Head coverings were the medieval must-have, like a smartphone you wore on your noggin. Hats and hoods shielded you from frost, sunburn, and drizzle while shouting your social status, relationship status, and how much you loved your local saint. They ranged from basic cloth wraps you could slap on in a hurry to bonkers headgear that needed an engineering degree to assemble and a prayer to keep from toppling during a brisk walk. Clothing maintenance was a full-time hustle that'd make a modern tailor sweat. Everyone was a DIY seamstress patching tears, swapping out worn bits, and resizing gear as bodies grew or shrank. Tossing a ripped tunic. Unthinkable clothes were too pricey. Medieval folks were the MacGyvers of mending stitching and darning their way to garments that lasted longer than most modern marriages. Switching seasonal wardrobes was a medieval mission impossible. Unlike our ooh, it's sweater weather vibe, they had two modes: winter's heavy wool fortress and summer's slightly less heavy wool breeze. No in-between, no capsule wardrobe for crisp fall days. Planning the swap was like prepping for a moon landing because your 3 outfits had to cover all bases, and chilly but not Arctic wasn't an option. Laundry, as we've groaned about, was a seasonal saga, not a weekend chore. You'd wait till the weather played nice, the village had enough hands, and your clothes were so grimy they could stand up solo. It was like washing for a small army. Except your washer was a river, your detergent was hope. This works, soap, and your dryer was a week of sunny vibes or a damp disaster. Clothes in medieval times were your walking resume, spilling tea on your class cash flow, love life job, and hometown faster than a gossip at a feast. One glance at your tunic's cut color or threadbare patches, and folks could peg your whole deal think LinkedIn but woven and way judgier. A frayed hem wasn't just a faux pas, it was a public I'm broke post. Your wardrobe was also your 401k. A solid wool cloak or a fancy gown was like inheriting a condo, big bucks, big deal. Families passed down these treasures like heirloom jewels, making every clothing choice a financial flex. Not just, this looks cute, buying a new dress. That's a boardroom decision, not a mall spree. Medieval fashion wasn't about self-expression or chasing trends. It was about not freezing, flashing your status, and making your 3 outfits last till your grandkids needed them. It was a system so practical it hurt, and so rigid you'd need a crowbar to tweak it. Compared to our new jeans, every season, it was like dressing for a marathon where the finish line was still alive. From the sartorial splendor of medieval fashion, we now dive into how these wool-clad folks killed time when they weren't dodging death by plague, famine, or rogue cow. By free time, I mean those rare slivers between sunrise grunt work and sunset exhaustion, when entertainment options made modern nothing on Netflix whining sound like a first world tantrum. Medieval fun was pure DIY. Your entertainment system was your mouth hands and whatever random junk you could scrounge. No Wi-Fi, no subscriptions, just raw creativity. It was like a no-budget talent show with no mute button, no rewind, and a high chance your content would flop harder than a knight in muddy armor. Storytelling was the castle's prime-time hit, like binge-watching TV, but with a sweaty bard in your face instead of a screen. The playlist, whatever tales the storyteller could dredge up from memory. Switching channels meant waiting for them to wrap up, or rudely shouting next, a move riskier than stealing the Lord's last chicken leg if the yarn had been dragging for hours. These storytellers were medieval Netflix showrunners minus algorithms. They read the room or dodged thrown bread to keep folks hooked, relying on gut instinct and a knack for drama. Bore the crowd. They ditch you for more thrilling tasks like untangling thread or staring at goats. Stories ran the gamut: epic nightly quests with dragons, juicy local gossip family sagas, or don't do this or you'll end up cursed warnings. They weren't just fun, they taught lessons, preserved lore, and filled dark evenings when candles were too pricey to burn for frivolous stuff like seeing your own hands. Religious tales were box office smashes, not just because folks were pious, but because they packed more action than a Marvel flick. Saints pulling miracles, biblical heroes defying odds, and good versus evil showdowns were both soul-saving and edge-of-your-bench thrilling, especially when your daily drama was, will the bread rise or not? Music was another castle banger, but forget Spotify's endless library. No recordings, no radio, just live performances in stone halls built for defense, not acoustics. The sound bounced like a pinball and volume control. That was hoping the lute guy didn't get too hyped or too whispery. Instruments were whatever local whittlers or traders could whip up. Flutes and pipes were DIY projects for anyone with a knife and a sense of pitch. Harps were high roller gear needing pro craftsmanship and screaming, "I'm loaded," louder than a gold-encrusted goblet. They were the medieval equivalent of a custom guitar, fancy and finicky. Drums were MVPs thumping for dances and doubling as the castle's group chat. Made from stretched hides over wood, they ranged from simple hand slappers to big boys that could wake the whole courtyard with a party's starting boom. They were like a medieval subwoofer minus the noise complaints. Singing was the ultimate equalizer, no gear needed, just lungs. From monk-level chants that took years to master to rowdy folk tunes you'd pick up after a few ales everyone could join. Group sing-alongs were medieval karaoke building vibes where you felt like a rock star, not just a potato-peeling serf. Dancing was a full-body workout social mixer, and entertainment smash rolled into one. Picture a flash mob in heavy wool and clunky shoes, needing ninja-level coordination to avoid tripping into the fireplace. These dances were team efforts with formations so complex they'd make a modern TikTok choreographer cry. Dances varied from easy-peasy circle spins for newbies to duo moves that demanded trust practice, and a silent prayer your partner wouldn't yeet you across the hall. It was like line dancing, but the lines were wobbly, the calls were in Old French, and a misstep could mean a bruised ego or a broken ankle on stone. Games were brain candy with a side of medieval hustle. Dice games ruled because anyone could carve dice from bone rules were quick to learn, and you could bet a crust of bread or your least holy sock. They were the castle's poker night, playable anywhere you could find a flattish spot. Chess was the Brainiac's Flex, a game for nobles who treated it like war prep. It needed smarts, and patience moves could take longer than a siege. Chess sets were art pieces carved from ivory or stone, doubling as decor when you weren't checkmating your cousin. Playing was like a medieval TED Talk deep fancy and a bit show-offy. Card games were a bit of a novelty in the early medieval days, but they started dealing in big time as trade routes brought playing cards from far-off lands. These cards weren't your dollar store deck. They were hand-painted masterpieces so pricey, only the castle's VIPs could afford them. Hosting a card night was like flashing a Rolex screaming, "I'm loaded," while everyone ignored the priest's side-eye about gambling sins. It was high-roller fun with a splash of hope. I don't bet my best cow. Board games played with stones or carved bits were the people's champ cheap local and open to all. They ranged from quick pick-up and play strategy matches to brain-melting marathons that demanded more planning than a siege. These games sharpened your wits for real-life hustles, like managing grain, dodging feuds, or sweet-talking your grumpy lord. Juggling and acrobatics were the medieval equivalent of a circus with zero safety nets. Jugglers tossed anything from leather balls to wooden clubs to stray kitchen spoons, putting on shows that mixed mad skills with please-don't-brain-yourself thrills. It was like watching a modern stunt show, but the only regulation was try not to break the Lord's fancy chair. Riddles and word games were brainy fun that needed nothing but your noggin and a quick tongue. These verbal sparring matches were like medieval improv, sharpening your language lore and ability to roast your buddy without starting a blood feud. A good quip could boost your rep faster than a shiny new tunic. Seasonal festivals were the castle's Super Bowl, mashing up holy days with epic parties. Work got the day off, and everyone dove into feasts, contests, and music that'd make a modern holiday bash look tame. These blowouts were like hitting the reset button on medieval grind, giving folks a chance to eat, laugh, and forget about the turnip harvest for a hot minute. Wrestling and physical contests were medieval CrossFit with bragging rights. They let you flex your muscles, dodge skills, and competitive streak while prepping for real-world chores like hauling hay or fending off bandits. Think sports. But the gear was your body, maybe some leather padding, and the field was "Don't die." Animal shows brought by wandering performers were the castle's exotic Netflix special. Trained dogs, dancing bears, or falconry demos showed off human-beast teamwork that locals geeked out over but rarely saw. It was like a zoo trip, but the animals did tricks, and you didn't have to pay for parking. Evening fun hinged on candlelight rations, post-dawn to dusk energy levels, and the fact that you'd be stuck with these folks forever, so pick something everyone could stomach. It was entertainment by committee. If the loot guy bombed or the story dragged, the crowd would pivot to something less snooze-worthy, like arm wrestling or guess the smell. Fun followed the season's winter meant huddling indoors for stories and songs, since outdoor stuff was a frostbite gamble. Come summer, everyone spilled outside for games and dances, soaking up daylight and air that didn't reek of smoke. It was like choosing between Netflix on the couch or a park picnic, but with more sheep and fewer screens. After chuckling over the castle's after-hours antics, let's dive into the daily grind, a schedule so brutal it'd make a modern union boss pass out and a productivity guru rethink their hustle-hard mantra. Work kicked off at sunrise and wrapped at sunset if you were lucky, because medieval life didn't do clocking out. Extra hours, as regular as rain since survival was a full-time gig. Weekends paid vacation, those were as real as a dragon's dental plan. Work was built on the vibe that slacking meant starving, and time off only happened when every chore was done. Spoiler, that was never because medieval life spawned tasks faster than a bard spun tales. Most castle folks were up before dawn, not because they loved mornings, but because daylight was gold and sleeping in was like burning money. Early starts maxed out sunlit hours for jobs needing sharp eyes, saving firelight for tasks where squinting at shades of dirt brown wasn't a deal breaker. Kitchen crew were the castle's early birds firing up, while stars still twinkled and everyone else was dreaming of an extra snooze. Whipping up grub for dozens with medieval tech was a logistical feat that'd make a Michelin chef cry in awe. No pre-chopped veggies or sick days here, just wrangling massive fires in pots heavy enough to anchor a ship. Bakers beat even the cooks to the punch, starting so early they could have partied with the owls. Bread making was a marathon, not a sprint, and rushing it churned out loaves so tough you'd rather starve. It was like running a bakery with gear that demanded constant babysitting brute force, and timing tighter than a SpaceX launch, all for a crusty breakfast. Stable hands and animal wranglers rolled out of bed with the enthusiasm of knowing horses don't get lazy Sundays. Feeding, watering, grooming, and saddling up was non-negotiable. Slacking meant cranky steeds, or worse, a food supply that clucked its last. These critters were the castle's Uber grocery store and stock market, so you didn't mess around. Blacksmiths fired up their forges as soon as the flames could melt iron, a job like running a mini steel mill with zero AC. Pounding out tools, weapons, and hinges needed muscles, know-how, and heat tolerance that'd qualify you for a superhero gig. Keeping that fire roaring all day. Pure medieval masochism. Women's work was a multitasking masterclass that'd make a modern CEO weep. They juggled cooking, sewing, kid wrangling, and castle upkeep with the precision of a circus act. It was like running a catering biz, a tailor shop, and a daycare while keeping standards high enough to avoid a needs improvement from the lady of the house. Textile work was a time suck that demanded skills from wool whisperer to stitch sorceress. Spinning raw fibers into thread was the ultimate background hustle. Do it while herding kids stirring stew or gossiping, but don't slack or your yarn would look like a dragon's bad hair day. That thread had to be tough enough for clothes meant to outlast a dynasty. Weaving was next level, needing focus time and a loom that was basically a medieval mech suit. These contraptions churned out fabric from peasant rough to noble soft, depending on your skills and raw materials. It was like running a one-woman Etsy shop, except your product was the family's only wardrobe. Sewing was straight-up artistry, with hand-stitched seams so solid they'd survive a Viking raid. Every woman was a tailor, wielding needles like wizards and crafting clothes to endure years of scrubbing, hauling, and whoops, I fell in the mud. It was couture for the apocalypse, not a catwalk. Childcare wasn't a standalone gig. It was baked into every task. Kids pitched in as soon as they could toddle, going from "don't eat that" to "here's how you churn butter in a flash." It was like a family startup where the intern started at age 7, learning the ropes to eventually run the show. Men's work leaned hard into brawn and brains. Beyond blacksmithing and stable duties, they handled construction and repairs to keep the castle from crumbling or letting invaders waltz in. Building with basic tools and local stones was like modern construction, but with 0 power drills and a safety manual that read, "Don't get squashed, good luck." Hunting was the nobility's idea of a fun day out, and a hardcore grocery run rolled into one. It demanded ninja-level tracking animal whisperer smarts and the skill to wield medieval weapons without skewering your own foot. Think modern camping meets Top Chef, but with crappier gear, lower success rates, and no backup plan. Like pop to the store. If you came back empty-handed, miss the deer and its turnip stew again. Farming kept the castle crew busy in season, leaning on old-school know-how honed through centuries of, well, that crop failed. Let's try again. It was like modern organic farming, but organic by default, powered by sweaty humans and grumpy oxen instead of tractors, and blissfully ignorant of soil pH or bug sprays. Your harvest was a gamble with Mother Nature, and she wasn't known for playing fair. Castle maintenance was a never-ending DIY nightmare, from patching stone walls to fixing creaky beams and sharpening tools that kept the place running. It was like binge-watching a home reno show, but your supplies were whatever's lying around. Your tools were Stone Age chic, and your contractor was whoever hadn't fled screaming when the wall started crumbling. Textile maintenance was as clutch as making the clothes in the first place. Darning holes, slapping on patches, and MacGyvering repairs kept garments alive way past their expiration date. It was like restoring vintage Levi's, but for your everyday tunic, using scraps you scrounged and skills that'd make a modern seamstress weep with respect or exhaustion. Cleaning the castle was a gritty chore, tailored to a world of stone, wood, and cohabitating critters minus any plumbing. It was like modern housekeeping. If your house laughed at bleach, your cleaning supplies were boiled herbs and elbow grease, and clean meant nobody's died of filth yet. Scrub. Hard those floors weren't complaining. Food preservation was the castle's high-stakes MasterChef challenge, where timing and skill decided if you'd feast or famine come winter. Salting, smoking, and fermenting were the name of the game, needing know-how so deep it was practically wizardry. It was like modern canning, but with zero Tupperware and a vibe of nail this, or we're eating boots by February. Water management was a juggling act of keeping wells flowing, tossing waste somewhere it wouldn't haunt you, and praying the water stayed drinkable-ish. It was like running a city water department, but you're the department, your tech is a bucket, and purification meant boil it and hope. One bad move and the castle's sipping Oda swamp. The daily grind danced to the tune of seasons weather and whatever crisis popped up, not some 9 to 5 clock. Workers pivoted like startup hustlers, tackling whatever the day threw at them with the flexibility of a yoga guru and the problem-solving chops of a medieval MacGyver. Fixed schedules, chaos was the boss. Breaks happened when life allowed, not when a policy said so. You'd scarf a hunk of bread nap or deal with a rogue chicken when you could not, because HR mandated wellness time. It was flexible scheduling, medieval style. Flexible, like do it now, or the cow's loose, not? I prefer mornings. From the back-breaking grind of medieval work, we limp into the wild world of medical care, because when you're hauling stones or dodging rogue oxen, you're bound to end up with a boo-boo or two. Modern folks would sprint to urgent care, but medieval peeps patched themselves up with herbs, prayers, and a well, at least. I'm not dead yet. Shrug. Getting a second opinion. That was just asking the priest if your soul was ready for checkout. Medieval medicine was a bonkers blend that'd make modern docs clutch their stethoscopes while holistic healers nod like told you so. It mixed sharp-eyed observation Granny's old remedies, faith that God's got your back, and body theories wild enough to star in a sci-fi flick. Think of it as part witchy wisdom, part let's hope this doesn't kill you. The castle's doctor was less MD and more guy who's seen some stuff. They learned by shadowing inheriting family tricks, or just winging it until something worked or didn't. They were your GP, pharmacist, surgeon, and life coach rolled into one, armed with I watched my uncle do this once, and a prayer it wasn't a total flop. Diagnosing your woes was like playing medieval Clue, checking symptoms, quizzing you on last week's stew, and tossing in some star chart mumbo-jumbo. They leaned on theories tying your sniffles to the moon's mood or the weather's attitude, plus the idea that your body's 4 humors were throwing a party and got out of whack. It was like a modern checkup, but with horoscopes and more, maybe it's evil spirits. The 4 humors, blood phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile, were the medieval medical Bible explaining sickness, like a fantasy novel plot. Too much blood. You're cranky. Too much bile. Fever City. Health was about keeping these fluids in a happy balance, like juggling imaginary smoothies no one could prove existed. It was the 1200s version of eat your veggies, but for mystery juices. Treatment was all about humor harmony, using tricks like tweaking your diet, brewing herbal potions, or, draining your fluids. Bleeding, purging, or telling you to chill by the fire were the go-to moves. It was like modern wellness fads, but the science was pure fanfic. The risks were, oops, you're dead, and the side effects could outshine the actual disease. Bloodletting was the rock star cure based on the idea that you had too much blood sloshing around, making you sick. They'd slice you with a knife slap on some leeches, or use suction cups to siphon it out. It was like donating blood, but for health with zero sterile vibes, and a logic that'd make a vampire facepalm. Bloodletting gear included razor-sharp blades, fancy suction cups, and leeches treated like pampered pets. Leeches were the VIPs precise, with built-in numbing juice, so you barely noticed them slurping your life force. It was medieval precision tech, like a Roomba for your veins, but squishier and creepier. Herbal medicine was the castle's drugstore built on centuries of this plant didn't kill Grandpa Wisdom. They knew which greens eased aches, cooled fevers, or patched wounds learned through trial error. And a lot of hope. You're feeling lucky. It was like a modern herbalist's dream, but with more dirt under the nails. The herb garden was the castle's holy grail, tended like a prized poodle, because it was everyone's lifeline. It was your CVS, but you had to grow your own pills. The stock changed with the seasons, and your prescription depended on whether the sage liked your soil or the rain showed up. Herbal remedies came as teas, goopy poultices for slathering on cuts, oils squeezed out with monk-level patience, or powders you'd stir into your gruel. It was like modern naturopathy, but fresh brewed, based on gut instinct over lab tests, and dosed with a hearty A looks about right. Pain relief leaned on plants with punch. Willow barked nature's aspirin, dulled aches and fevers. Poppy juice. Hello, opium was a heavy hitter knocking out pain, but with a don't get too cozy, warning medieval folks sensed even without DARE. It was like popping an Advil if Advil grew in your backyard and might send you to Narnia. Alcohol was the go-to for pain, and don't scream juice during medieval surgeries. Docs aimed for a Goldilocks buzz, sloshed enough to not feel the knife, but awake enough to not pass out. It was like modern anesthesia, but your anesthesiologist was a jug of ale and a vibe check. Surgery was a last-ditch effort limited to what you could hack with basic tools and zero clue about germs or anatomy. They could set bones, stitch wounds, yank arrows, or lop off limbs, but anything fancier was sorry, you're on your own. It was like modern trauma care if your ER was a barn and your surgeon moonlighted as a butcher. Surgical tools were straight out of a blacksmith's fever dream. Knives, bone saws, needles, and grabbers for fishing out shrapnel. Crafted locally and cleaned with whatever was handy, they'd make a modern OR team faint. They were cutting edge for the 1200s, but that edge was often hope it's sharp enough. Wound care was a gritty crash course in don't die from that cut. They'd rinse gashes with the cleanest water they could scrounge, often still sketchy slather on herb goops that doubled as nature's antiseptic, and wrap it in cloth to keep out medieval muck. It was like modern first aid, but with a vibe of hope, this rag's clean, half-baked germ knowledge and results, as predictable as a dice roll in a tavern brawl. Childbirth was in the hands of midwives' badass ladies who learned by shadowing and delivering babies like it was their cardio. They knew the drill for smooth births and had tricks for when things went sideways, all from years of been there birthed that. It was like modern OBGYN care, but run by Granny's wisdom with zero sterile gloves or C-section backups, just gut instinct and a prayer the kid showed up healthy. Dental care. If your tooth screamed louder than a banshee, it was time to yank it. They used pliers that looked like torture tools, powered by a quick tug and a strong grip. No numbing shots here. It was like modern dental surgery, but your dentist was the castle's toughest dude. Anesthesia was a slug of ale, and success meant you didn't croak from shock or a rogue infection. Mental health care leaned on the idea that your bad vibes came from wonky humors, a ticked-off spirit, or maybe a demon photobombed your soul. Fixes ranged from herb brews to priestly pep talks to straight-up exorcisms. It was like modern therapy, but with holy water, less how does that make you feel, and more let's yeet that ghost out of your head. Epidemics like the plague were fought with medieval social distancing, locking up the sick, dodging outsiders, and trying whatever worked last time. They didn't know about germs, but they noticed stay away from coughers kept you alive. It was like modern quarantine, but with less Netflix and more hope, the village isn't cursed. Life expectancy was short enough to make a mayfly jealous thanks to sky-high baby. Deaths, gnarly work hazards, iffy doctoring, and plagues that could wipe out half the crew in a hot minute. Medieval folks knew life was a coin toss, so they leaned hard into get right with God over live to 100. It was less health goals and more eternal life prep. Preventive medicine was all about lifestyle hacks, eat this walk, that keep your humors chill. It was like modern wellness TikToks, but instead of tracking macros, you balanced imaginary body juices. Tips came from old school wisdom, not WebMD, aiming to keep you in sync with nature rather than chasing a Fitbit badge. Prayer was the MVP of medieval medicine, not a sidekick. Every treatment came with a side of God. Please fix this, because healing needed divine Wi-Fi as much as herbs. It was healthcare where a priest's blessing was as clutch as a bandage, unlike modern medicine's take two and call me later vibe. Herb know-how was deep, like a medieval WebMD for plants. They knew which leaves zapped fevers or soothed cuts, learned through centuries of this didn't kill us. Write it down. It was like modern herbal supplements, but the main event, not a side hustle mixed with humor theories that gave every remedy a wild backstory. Medical training was straight up apprentice mode shadow, a grizzled healer, get your hands dirty, and hope you didn't botch too many patients. It was like modern residency, but with less anatomy textbooks and more watch and learn. You graduated by not killing too many folks, not by acing a multiple choice test. From the herbal hocus pocus of medieval medicine, we stumble into education. A system about as similar to modern schools as a castle is to a strip mall. Sure, people gather, but one's got Wi-Fi and the other's got walls. Medieval learning leaned hard on the do it till you don't suck philosophy, where you hammered away at a skill until you nailed it or ditched it for something less likely to ruin your day. The castle was a one-stop learning hub, dishing out lessons from Don't Starve 101 to fancy sword-making masterclass. No chalkboards or syllabi here. Your classroom was life, your textbook was trial and error, and your profs were anyone who knew a trick and wasn't too grumpy to share. It was like a trade school where your boss was also your teacher. Every lecture ended in a pop quiz called dinner or disaster, and failing meant turnips again. Literacy was a rare flex, mostly for priests, nobles, and the odd clerk who needed to scribble something besides IOU, one pig. For most castle folks, reading was as useful as knowing how to code Python in 1200 cool, but not going to help you milk the cow. Words on parchment. That's wizard stuff, not survival stuff. The lucky few who could read learned through church classes or noble tutors starting as kids and grinding for years under monks or scholars who'd been through the same slog. It was like getting a PhD, but you're 7, your homework's in Latin, and it's all about Jesus instead of job skills or Jane Austen. Books were medieval unicorns, so rare and pricey, owning one was like parking a Ferrari in your stable. Most were holy texts, hand-copied by monks who'd spent years mastering the art of not smudging ink. These manuscripts were part Bible, part art gallery with glowy letters and doodles that took more skill than painting a cathedral ceiling. The castle's library, if it even existed, might boast a dozen books chained to desks to stop sticky-fingered serfs. Reading was like using a public computer, but your screen was sheepskin, took a decade to make, and couldn't be edited without starting from scratch. It was less casual Kindle and more handle with awe mortal. For the average Joe, education was all about apprenticeships, learned by doing, guided by a grizzled pro who'd learned the same way. These skill trees stretched back generations like a family recipe for how to not botch a horseshoe. It was hands-on learning with stakes nail it, you're useful. Flub it, you're fetching water forever. Kids started their internships as soon as they could toddle, tackling chores like hauling buckets or shoeing chickens. These gigs taught work ethic while keeping the castle humming. It was like a modern co-op program, but you're 6, it lasts till you're grown, and your degree is ready to adult. Boys learned guy stuff like blacksmithing, carpentry, sword sharpening, hunting, or plowing fields, jobs needing muscle or deemed too manly for the ladies by medieval vibes. Their training prepped them to pay bills in grain, fend off bandits, and keep the castle's economy chugging. Take the blacksmith's apprentice. You'd start by stoking fires and sorting tools, eyeballing the master's hammer swings like a hawk. Eventually, you'd get to poke hot metal under a glare that said, "Don't burn the place down." It was a slow grind from watch to wield, keeping you safe-ish, while you learned to not melt your face off. Girls mastered lady skills like spinning wool, cooking stew, running the household, wrangling kids, and brewing herbal fixes. These weren't hobbies, they were the glue holding families together. Training was intense, turning girls into domestic superheroes who could whip up a tunic or a poultice while babysitting and not torching the stew. Textile school for girls was a saga process. Flax or wool, spin it into thread, weave it on a loom, dye it with whatever berries didn't poison you, and sew it into clothes that'd last a decade. It was like Project Runway, but your runway was don't freeze, and your fabric was hope. This holds up. Cooking class meant mastering fire, hacking up ingredients with flinty knives, preserving food for winter, and planning meals with whatever wasn't moldy. It was like culinary school, but your menu was what's in the barrel. Your stove was a pit, and screwing up meant hungry kids, not a bad Yelp review. Religious education was universal, though it ranged from say your prayers for peasants to memorize Latin psalms for nobles. Everyone learned the basics, prayers' core beliefs, and how to behave at church, baked into daily life and big festival days. It was less elective and more get with the program or explain yourself to God. For noble kids, religious education was like signing up for a theological boot camp. They didn't just memorize prayers, they tackled Latin, wrestled with deep God talk, and prepped to play spiritual babysitter for their future peasants. It was like modern seminary, but mashed up with lordly lessons, less become a priest, and more run a castle without ticking off heaven. Math wasn't about chasing pie, it was about not getting screwed at the market or miscounting your cabbages. You learned to tally crops, haggle trades, and juggle numbers for castle chores through gritty practice. It was like business math, but your classroom was a muddy field. Your stocks were actual pigs, and nobody cared about calculus. The castle's steward, the guy keeping the coins grub and chaos in check, needed math chops to add, subtract, and not lose track of the ale barrels. He learned to crunch numbers, measure sacks, and scribble ledgers through trial and error. It was like accounting school, but your spreadsheets were parchment. Your assets were literal turnips, and your boss was a grumpy lord. Medical training, as we've seen, was a watch do, don't kill anyone apprenticeship. You shadowed a healer, mixed herbs, and eventually stitched up wounds when you proved you wouldn't botch it. It was hands-on high stakes and less textbook anatomy, and more hope this guy lives. Music lessons were for the tuneful few taught by wandering bards, castle crooners, or your musically inclined aunt. You'd strum local lutes, belt folk jams, or join church sing-alongs, learning by ear and vibe. It was like music camp, but your stage was a smoky hall, and your playlist was whatever grandma remembers. Legal know-how came from tagging along at court, apprenticing with a law nerd, or watching how feuds got settled without bloodshed usually. No law schools, no bar exam, just customs, and that's how we've always done it. It was like a legal internship, but your case law was Lord Bob's ruling in '97, and your office was a drafty tent. Military training turned boys into castle defenders or wannabe conquerors. They practiced sword swings, plotted battle plans, rode horses without face planting, and honed war skills through drills hunts and tagging along on real skirmishes. It was like ROTC, but your simulations were don't die in the forest, and your coach was a grizzled knight. Medieval education was a full contact sport, woven into every chore and hustle, not a phase you clocked out of before adulting. It was tailored to your gig, noble serf, or sword slinger, and success meant you could handle your role without someone holding your hand. It was like a modern gap year, but you learned life, not just vibes. Knowledge was mostly passed mouth to ear, with pros showing you the ropes through chatter demos and try it kid. No PowerPoints, just personal bonds. Your teacher wasn't just your mentor, they were your neighbor who'd judge your shoddy plow job later. It kept skills local like a craft beer recipe with extra you had to be there. Progress wasn't graded with bubble sheets, it was, can you do the thing? You aced a skill when you could nail it solo, no hand-holding. Standards were real-world forge, a decent nail, bake edible bread, or don't burn the castle down. No gold stars, just, you're not fired yet. Graduation was when you could run your own hut, ply your trade, and not embarrass your family. No cap and gown selfie. Just folks nodding like he's not useless anymore. It hit in your late teens or early 20s, depending on whether you were slinging swords or mastering stew. For the brainiacs or future bigwigs, advanced training meant longer apprenticeships, pilgrimages to scholar hubs, or cozying up to a master guru. It was like grad school, but your thesis was don't ruin the harvest, only a few got in, and the goal was be useful now, not publish or perish. From the hands-on schooling that turned castle kids into survival pros, we now swagger into the castle's security setup, a system so hardcore it made medieval life feel like a high-stakes action flick way spicier than modern folks. Did I lock the door worries. Castle defense boiled down to one rule: make your crib so annoying to raid that baddies would rather hit up the neighbor's undefended shack than dodge arrows scaling your walls. The castle's spot was picked with a paranoia that'd impress a modern spy. Plopped on high ground, it offered eagle-eye views of the countryside, so no sneaky army could roll up without being spotted from a mile away. It was like a medieval ring doorbell, but instead of a push alert, you got time to load the crossbows and prep a welcome party with pointy sticks. The surrounding land was pimped out for max defense trees, chopped ditches, dug and open fields cleared to make charging knights trip or get picked off like ducks in a medieval arcade game. This landscaping wasn't for curb appeal. It was like setting up a home security system with shovels and sweat instead of cameras and apps. The castle walls were straight-up beasts, thick as a dragon's ego and taller than a giant's Tinder profile. At 10 to 20 feet wide and 40 to 60 feet high, they laughed at catapults, rams, and invaders dumb enough to try. These stone tanks were like modern bunkers, but built to shrug off medieval tantrums, not missiles. Building those walls was a masterclass in, we don't need no blueprints. Masons leaned on gut instinct and old-school tricks, juggling load-bearing magic, and don't let it fall know-how passed down like a secret stew recipe. It was civil engineering medieval style, local rocks no math, and battle-tested when some warlord got salty. Walls were decked out with party favors for unwanted guests. Battlements let defenders yeet arrows or chuck rocks while ducking return fire. Murder holes. Yep, that's what they called them. Were ceiling traps perfect for dumping boiling oil or other surprise snacks on intruders who thought they'd cracked the gate. It was like rigging your porch with Home Alone traps, but deadlier. Gates were the castle's Achilles heel, so they got the VIP security treatment. Heavy doors beefed up with iron bands scoffed at battering rams. Portcullis's giant iron grates that dropped like a guillotine slammed the door on invaders. Inside guardrooms let defenders ambush anyone who slipped through like a bouncer squad with swords. The gatehouse was the castle's Fort Knox, built to keep fighting even if the walls got breached. It was like a mini-castle within a castle, bristling with go-away vibes and manned by guards whose job was less check IDs and more stab. First, ask questions never. Think airport security, but with more spikes and zero chill. Water was guarded like it was liquid gold, because a dry castle was a we surrender castle. Wells tucked safe inside the walls often had their own mini-forts to stop enemies from spiking the supply with poison or just being jerks. It was like protecting your Wi-Fi router, but wet and way more life or death. Food stashes were planned like a doomsday prepper's bunker accessible. Even if the castle was cut off for months, grain, salt, pork, and ale were hoarded in spots invaders couldn't touch. It was like modern emergency kits, but for feeding a small army using hope it's not moldy tech instead of MREs. The armory was a medieval gun shop, packed with swords, spears, crossbows, and armor all polished and ready for when some neighbor got too greedy. Unlike modern safes, these weapons were for instant grab-and-go handed to guards, trained to swing first and negotiate later. It was less locked away and more who wants to rumble. Weapon upkeep was a full-time gig needing know-how in metalwood, and don't let this break mid-fight. Swords got sharpened, armor de-rusted, and crossbows tweaked like finicky race cars. It was like modern gear maintenance, but done by locals learned through Watch Me. Lessons and driven by fix-it or die stakes. Guards worked shifts to keep eyes on the horizon and swords at the ready. They were like modern rent-a-cops, but trained to brawl armed with medieval hardware and less de-escalate and more end it. Guard life was all about see bad guy, stab bad guy, not filling out incident reports. Guard duty meant pacing wall-top routes, chilling in towers with killer views and blasting horns or lighting signal fires if trouble loomed. It was like modern patrols, but your beat was a windy rampart, your lookout was a vertigo-inducing turret, and your call for backup was a bonfire or a loud toot. The castle's defense was a layered cake of pain, outer walls, inner walls, traps, and more forcing invaders to slog through a gauntlet of misery. Even if they cracked the front door, they'd hit more defenses like trying to raid a bank, only to find another bank inside. It was medieval not today, engineering at its finest. Siege prep was like medieval doomsday prepping, but instead of hurricanes, you're bracing for a grumpy warlord's tantrum. Stockpiling food weapons and grit let the castle hold out for months while still tossing arrows at invaders. It was like modern survival kits, but for a whole crew with a side of fight back instead of just hunker down. The castle's vibe was as much a weapon as its walls flexing so hard it made wannabe attackers rethink their life choices. Those towering stones and spiky gates screamed, "Try me, bro," pure medieval flexing to scare off trouble before swords got drawn. It was psychological warfare via architecture, like a beware of dog sign, but the dog's a fortress. Inside communication was a lo-fi masterpiece, hornblast runners yelling, "Yo, trouble's coming," and coded signals that got the job done without a single walkie-talkie. It was like modern comms, but your Wi-Fi was a dude with fast legs and your group chat was a trumpet toot. Everyone knew meant grab your sword. The castle played nice with nearby villages to lock in backup during raids and keep gossip flowing about sketchy neighbors. It was like modern diplomacy, but instead of embassies, you had ale-fueled chats with Farmer Bob sealed with handshakes, not treaties, all to make sure you weren't blindsided by a sneak attack. Defense drills were run like clockwork, so everyone knew their gig when arrows started flying. It was like modern fire drills, but swap the fire for invaders, add sword-swinging skills, and know that screwing up meant game over for real. Practice made perfect, or at least kept you alive. Keeping the castle battle-ready was a budgeting nightmare balancing food swords and arrows against, can we afford this? It was like modern defense spending, but your Pentagon was one stressed-out lord. Your economy was a few fields, and your supply chain was hope. The harvest's good. Diplomacy was your first line of defense, schmoozing nearby lords to keep them from getting stabby. It was like modern foreign relations, but you're cutting deals over mead with your cousin-in-law, banking on family ties and don't mess with me vibes instead of UN resolutions. Staying ready meant obsessing over details, sharpening blades, polishing armor, and making sure the guards weren't napping. It was like modern security upkeep, but done by hand, learned through Watch Me. Grit and driven by if this breaks were toast panic instead of a paycheck. Spies weren't cloaked in black. They were chatty traders, nosy travelers, or your buddy down the road spilling tea on who's sharpening too many spears. It was like modern intel, but your satellites were gossip. Your CIA was personal pals, and your global threats were that jerk 2 hills over. Blending security with daily life was a tightrope walk. Keep the castle locked down without tripping over your own traps during laundry day. It was like modern office security, but for a whole village using medieval tech, like drawbridges instead of keycards, and fueled by we might die urgency, not just protect the printer. From the castle's beefy defenses that kept invaders at bay, we now dive into the real magic of medieval life. How folks found joy, purpose, and a reason to get up in a world that'd make moderns cry over a Wi-Fi outage. Forget knights and dragons. This is about regular Joes building epic communities with grit, teamwork, and a we're all in this mess together vibe that'd put modern self-help gurus to shame. The medieval castle wasn't just a pile of stones or a neighborhood, it was a full-on mini-universe where everyone had a job that mattered, every skill was clutch, and time was as real as a unicorn's LinkedIn profile. You didn't survive solo because frankly you'd be toast. It wasn't about being super nice. It was about knowing you'd sink or swim as a squad. Our tour through these drafty halls and smoky rooms has shown how medieval peeps tackled problems that'd leave us moderns Googling how to not die. Keeping warm. Chop trees, haul 'em, and pray the fire doesn't fizzle. staying clean, lug water, heat it and don't freeze your bits off. Feeding the gang, grow, grind, and preserve like your life depends on it, because it did. No room for whoops when the pantry's bare. These fixes weren't solo heroics. They were team plays that split the work, shared the know-how, and had each other's backs when someone's stew game flopped. The kitchen fed all not out of warm fuzzies, but because a hangry castle is a cranky castle. The blacksmith kept your plow sharp, not for kudos, but because dull tools meant no harvest, no bread, no bueno. It was community clutch time, 24/7. This teamwork was a social safety net, both beefier and shakier than our 401ks. Beefier because it covered cradle to grave food purpose, and a squad to call home. Shakier because it leaned on don't let your buddy down vibes, not some faceless insurance plan. One feud or lazy cook and the whole system could wobble. Life's tempo was a wild paradox fast, like a caffeinated squirrel, because survival meant nonstop hustle, but slow, like a dial-up modem since everything was handcrafted from socks to soup. You followed the sun seasons and your own stamina, not some buzzing smartwatch yelling, meeting in 5. This gave space for that warm glow of nailing a skill, helping your crew, or seeing your pal eat better because you fixed their plow. Work was a grind, but it hit different. Every axe swing or loaf baked had, this keeps us alive, zing that modern desk jockeys chase with vision boards. You didn't need a LinkedIn bio to feel like you mattered. Your village's full bellies were your KPI. Having next to nothing made life weirdly rich. With 3 outfits, max, each tunic was your BFF patched like a beloved teddy bear. Eating the same stew 365 ways, you became a flavor detective geeking out over is that extra time like a foodie at a Michelin joint. Less stuff meant more love for the little things. Fun didn't need tech, it thrived on raw human spark. Firelit yarns from your buddy beat Netflix because they were your stories about your world. A neighbor's loot jam hit harder than Spotify's top hits because it was live, messy, and sung by someone you'd see at breakfast. It was DIY entertainment with soul. Risk was medieval life's uninvited +1. Sickness storms or that shady lord next door could flip your world faster than a bad TikTok trend. But instead of curling up in a panic, folks savored the good stuff. Health sunshine, a fat harvest, or a day without arrows flying. It was carpe diem with chainmail. When stuff broke, and it always broke, you didn't call a hotline. You fixed it with whatever was lying around. Medieval folks were the MacGyvers of their day, rigging solutions that'd make a prepper jealous. No plumber, no prob, just grab a bucket and some optimism. The castle's social rules, which might make moderns clutch their pearls, were actually a cozy blanket of you belong. Everyone had a clear gig blacksmith's apprentice hammer this, kitchen hand, stir that. You knew what to do, how to level up, and when you'd earned props. No midlife crisis about what's my purpose. Your village handed you a script and you made it shine. Work, family, and community were one big stew, not separate in Tupperware. No work-life balance angst because work was life done with your besties, who'd both fix your cart and cry at your wedding. It was a seamless hustle that moderns chase with apps and yoga retreats. Kids grew up shadowing adults, easing into grown-up chores like they were leveling up in a game, not stressing over SATs. By 10, they'd churned butter or shoed goats building swagger from real wins, not participation trophies. It was childhood with a side of, you're ready, champ. Medieval folks knew their land like a hipster knows their coffee beans, not from eco textbooks but from daily dirt naps. They got how crops played with weather or wolves, not to save Earth but to not starve. It was green, living born of we're stuck with this dirt, so let's not ruin it. So medieval life wasn't just surviving a stone box, it was a masterclass in finding meaning in the grind. With ingenuity, community, and a knack for laughing at life's curveballs, they built bonds and purpose that'd make our good life checklists look like a to-do list for robots. Medieval folks didn't hug trees for fun. They stuck to nature's limits because overstepping meant a swift kick from reality, like an empty pantry or a grumpy forest with no more firewood. This gave them a PhD in enough is enough, finding zen in what their land could cough up, without throwing a tantrum, unlike our modern gimme more swipe right culture. Their spiritual game wasn't a Sunday-only deal, it was baked into every chore. Chopping wood. That's a prayer. Sharing stew. Holy teamwork. Helping your neighbor not starve. Straight up saint vibes. No need for self-help books or yoga retreats, meaning was in the daily grind, like a divine post-it note on every task. As we wrap our cozy tour of this wild stone world, the real kicker is how much these medieval weirdos can school us moderns. Not because life was a breeze spoiler, it was a brutal arrow dodging where's the soap slog, but because they nailed the art of thriving in a world that didn't come with an app or a warranty. They built squads where every rando mattered, from the guy forging nails to the gal baking bread that didn't break teeth. They mastered skills that paid the bills in turnips and gave that warm, fuzzy feeling of, I'm not useless. They found joy in what they had, not whining for what they didn't. Their BFFs were their coworkers, their safety net, and their beer pong team all in one. And somehow they kept cracking jokes through plagues and sieges. Tonight, as you snuggle into your cozy bed surrounded by gadgets that'd make a medieval lord faint, take a sec to tip your hat to how far we've come. Hello, indoor plumbing, and how much those castle peeps got right about living large with less. In the dark as you drift off, maybe chew on what links you to those wool-clad hustlers. The itch for a crew, the buzz of a job well done, the hug of belonging, and the knack for finding giggles in the grind, no matter how gnarly life gets. Sleep tight, thankful for your thermostat, and the timeless chutzpah that makes any life a banger.